What would be the consequences of offending a highly intelligent chemistry teacher? Just now Walter was driving to the bank to deposit some money. After waiting for a long time for a parking spot, Ken sped into it just before Walter could park. No matter how Walter honked in protest, Ken, who was on the phone, completely ignored him. Walter was seething with anger. Seeing Ken's arrogant license plate, Walter had no choice but to swallow his anger for the time being. In the bank lobby, Ken continued his phone conversation oblivious to others' feelings and was even using a fashionable Bluetooth headset at the time. You should know in the early 2000s, Bluetooth headsets were considered high-tech items. Every action Ken took displayed his sense of superiority. The parking spot-deprived Walter glared fiercely at Ken, thinking that he would teach Ken a lesson if he got the chance. As luck would have it, Walter got his chance soon after at a gas station where he ran into the show-off Ken. While Ken was in the store, Walter casually picked up a mop with water from the gas station, then naturally opened the hood of Ken's convertible BMW and placed the mop on the battery's terminals. With sparks flying, Walter carefully closed the hood and then left nonchalantly without looking back. It must be said that from this point on Walter began to slowly turn to the dark side, with the evil aspects of human nature increasingly manifesting in him. The reason Walter came to the bank was to deposit the money he brought in another way for his own use. Because his wife already knew about his condition, Skylar insisted on treating Walter even without money. Skylar enlisted the help of Hank and Marie to persuade Walter. Skylar planned to borrow money from friends and relatives, but Walter, due to his pride, refused to agree. He said he could take an advance on his pension. After his wife left, he took out the money he had hidden, ready to transfer it at the bank so he could use it for himself. This was the money left by the deceased Crazy 8, which in Skylar's eyes was of dubious origin. Just then, his son Walter Jr. burst in, and a panicked Walter quickly explained that he was catching a mouse. His son was puzzled by Walter's recent strange behavior. Walter Jr. left without listening to his explanation. Facing his son's misunderstanding, Walter could only silently accept it. On the way to the bank, Walter suddenly noticed a police car following him. Having done something bad, Walter felt like a startled bird and quickly hid the illicit money. Seeing that the police car was about to catch up, a panicked Walter began to slowly pull over, but the police car just zoomed past him. Once again scared by his own fears, Walter couldn't help but laugh at himself. The scene shifts to Jesse's house at night, where his friend Combo was invited over. Seeing a large hole burn through the ceiling in the hallway, Combo asked Jesse what had happened. Jesse quickly explained and then hurriedly changed the subject. Combo asked if Jesse was still into art, seemingly wanting to try some for free. They also mentioned Crazy 8 and Emilio. Jesse clearly stated that he didn't know their current situation, but he looked a bit guilty. The two friends trusted Jesse completely and didn't have the slightest doubt. Combo kept asking Jesse to share some contraband, wanting to have a good time at the bar with friends. Jesse planned to cash in on the contraband he had made with Walter, so he said he had a batch of top-tier stuff that they had never seen before. This piqued Combo's curiosity, but Jesse knew the potency of this contraband and didn't want his friends to get into trouble for the sake of their health. However, his friend thought Jesse was being stingy and turned to leave. To keep his two friends, Jesse reluctantly took out the hidden contraband to share. After a night of dealing with his contraband, Jesse was in a daze. Suddenly he saw two figures in black armor stopping at his front door. One of them was holding a large machete and the other was approaching with a grenade in hand. Soon the sound of knocking scared Jesse into scrambling away, but he didn't forget to take his contraband with him, and then he fled frantically through the back door. However, what Jesse didn't realize was that all this was just a hallucination. The ones knocking were just two students handing out advertisements. With nowhere else to go, Jesse shamelessly went to his parents' house, even getting his foot stuck in a chair, indicating he had likely climbed over the wall to sneak in. Because Jesse is a substance user, his parents treat him badly and look at him with disgust. He goes to the room where he used to live as a child, and the pictures he drew a long time ago are still hanging there. Exhausted, Jesse fell asleep immediately and didn't wake up until the next evening. His parents were discussing whether Jesse should stay and were suspicious of needle marks on his arms. Finally, Jesse woke up starving after not eating all day and asked his mother when dinner would be. It seemed he was planning to stay for a while. His mother awkwardly asked if he needed help washing his clothes, actually expressing her disgust at his dirtiness, but Jesse politely refused. Seeing Jesse head towards the dining room, his father decided to confront him, ready to kick him out if he hadn't turned over a new leaf. but seeing Jesse earnestly cleaning the table, the couple ultimately didn't have the heart to say anything. Jesse knew his parents' thoughts better than anyone, he just didn't want to argue about it. Jesse came to his younger brother Jake's room to see a wall full of medals of honor. It is clear that this younger brother in the minds of his parents is much better than him. Jesse was proud of his accomplished brother and wanting to fulfill his responsibility as an elder sibling, planned to take Jake out to talk about life. However, his mother worried that Jesse might lead Jake astray. She frequently came in to check on them and deliberately left the door open to prevent Jesse from doing anything inappropriate.
You see this? What am I, some criminal or something?
Whatever.
Whatever? Why, you think that's okay? Like, oh, we can't let that scumbag warp the mind of our favorite son.
I'm the favorite? Yeah, right. Practically all they ever talk about.
Frustrated, Jesse was left to brood alone in the yard. Back in bed, he tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Insomnia led him to open his closet. Looking at the toys he played with as a child and many of his favorite paintings, one in particular made Jesse laugh. The theme of the painting was his former chemistry teacher Walter, with a caption asking why Walter loved chemistry so much. On the back was one of his own poorly done chemistry papers, complete with comments from Walter. Clearly, Jesse was not interested in chemistry. His talent was in painting. Seeing these, Jesse once again thought of his recent regrettable experiences with Walter. Just then, his friend Combo called him, saying that the goods he gave him the previous day had been sold out in minutes, and asked if he had any more since many people were eagerly waiting for his supply. Unfortunately, Jesse indeed had none left. Hearing that the goods were in high demand, Jesse went to Walter the next day to see if he was still interested in continuing their contraband venture, but Walter, seeing him, was furious, thinking Jesse was there to set him up. When he hears what Jesse came for, Walter tells him to get lost. Then Jesse took out the money he had earned from selling the goods, saying he hadn't touched those items, that he had converted all the contraband into cash, and that this $4,000 was Walter's share. After saying this, Jesse threw the money into the air and left coolly, leaving Walter standing there dumbfounded. Seeing Jesse had gone and being short on cash himself, Walter quickly grabbed a nearby net. Though it was ill-gotten gains, the financially struggling Walter couldn't care less at this point. Jesse had just gotten home when his parents began treating him like a criminal again because the nanny had just found contraband in his room while cleaning. His parents, already looking for a legitimate reason to kick him out, now had irrefutable evidence. Seeing that his parents had issued an eviction order, a resigned Jesse grabbed his cigarette and left voluntarily. As Jesse waited for a car at the door, his underage brother Jake came out from the house. Surprisingly, the cigarette was actually his. Jake thanked his brother for taking the blame for him and pleaded for Jesse to return the cigarette. But as an elder brother, how could Jesse let his brother go down the wrong path? He crushed the cigarette right in front of Jake. However, Jesse didn't bother to defend himself because he knew his parents' perception of him. No matter what he said, they would never believe him. Both sons had tendencies to dabble in forbidden substances, which was enough to show that there were problems with the parents' upbringing. Meanwhile, Walter's wife took him to see the best local doctor. The doctor said his teen was very experienced and suggested that Walter undergo radiation and chemotherapy, noting their high success rate. But upon hearing about the possible side effects, Walter felt he couldn't accept them. Back at home, Skylar was constantly trying to convince Walter, telling him there was still a good chance his illness could be cured and discussing specific treatment times. But Walter seemed indifferent. He confessed to his wife that he didn't plan to undergo treatment because it would cost at least $90,000 and might not save his life. No matter how much his wife tried to persuade him, the stubborn Walter insisted, as he didn't want his family to bear such a huge burden. However, all of this was overheard by Walter Jr. Seeing how stubborn Walter was, Walter Jr. angrily said,
"Then why don't you just die already? Just give up and die."
What would you do if you had a son like this? Because he had no college degree, no professional certification, no work experience, and was a high school dropout, Jesse was ruthlessly mocked by the interviewer, who said that the model walking outside the window was more suited for him. At that moment, Jesse wished he could find a hole to crawl into. After facing such rejection, he stormed out, deeply regretting not having studied harder, which had led to this outcome. Just then, the model from the advertisement called out to him. Coincidentally, it was his friend Badger. They found a secluded spot to talk. Badger explained that he was on probation and needed to find a job to prove he had reformed. Like Jesse, he hadn't studied hard and could only find this kind of job. But Badger was just there to put on a show. The next second, Badger began asking Jesse if he could get some more contraband. Jesse said he had washed his hands of that life, decided to reform and start over. Hearing this, Badger is amazed, and he laments the need for someone of Jesse's caliber. Because Badger had once tried the crystal-grade contraband that Jesse and Walter had created, the profound impression it left on him was unforgettable. Jesse mentioned that his partner didn't follow the usual rules, leading to fewer and fewer clients. Actually, he was talking about Walter. Jesse had wanted to continue the partnership with Walter, but Walter had coldly rejected him. He knew that without Walter, he couldn't produce contraband of such high purity, so he decided to leave the trade and seek a new job. But Badger said he had channels for selling and that they were all big buyers. He proposed that they get back into the contraband business together. Seeing that it was almost time to go to work, Badger left in a hurry, instructing Jesse to think it over carefully. Jesse returned to his car and saw many job advertisements in the newspaper, but not a single one he qualified for. Reluctantly, he decided to go back to his old ways with Badger. After work, Badger rushed to Jesse's house, bringing a big bag full of snacks. Seeing the bullet holes in the RV door, a puzzled Badger asked what had happened. Jesse awkwardly explained that they were for ventilation. Badger was really easy to deceive. Seeing all sorts of bottles and jars, Badger was amazed, having never seen anything like this before. Just like Walter had done for him, Jesse explained the purpose of these bottles to Badger. Hearing Jesse speak so knowledgeably, Badger, who only finished elementary school, looked at Jesse with even more admiration. Proudly, Jesse told Badger, "This is just basic chemistry." That was exactly what Walter had once told him. Jesse checked the food supplies that Badger had brought and decided to officially start working. Unexpectedly, Badger also brought a crossbow, saying it was for hunting wild boars. It seems that Badger is even more adventurous than Jesse. The two drove to a remote area in the suburbs to start their first collaboration. At this moment, Jesse was in the same position Walter had been in initially. Seeing the mischievous Badger, he felt like he was looking at his former self. With the experience of making it together with Walter, the previously inattentive Jesse was exceptionally dedicated this time. After a day and night of hard work, Jesse finally produced the finished product. Badger was extremely excited, thinking they were going to make a fortune. However, Jesse stared at the product, clearly disappointed with what he had made. Looking at the murky crystals, they couldn't compare at all to the contraband Walter had produced, but the less demanding Badger was very satisfied with them. Wanting to make something as good as Walter's, Jesse ruthlessly dumped the freshly made product. Badger, seeing this, became irate and ranted at Jesse. Unable to understand his actions, Jesse also made his stance clear, saying he would continue until he was satisfied. However, when the second batch still didn't meet Jesse's standards and as he was about to dump it and start over, Badger disagreed. The two began a heated argument.
3 entire pounds of pseudo wasted! Do you know how long I had to spin that stupid sign?
Get off me, psycho!
Helicopter!
In the chaos, Jesse grabbed some chemical materials and attacked Badger, then forcefully pushed him out of the car. The partnership that had just started that day was officially disbanded. Meanwhile, Walter and his wife were invited to attend the birthday party of his friend Elliot. Elliot was the co-founder of Gray Matter, a company they started together when Walter was younger. Due to various reasons, Walter chose to leave, but now the company had gone public and made them billionaires. Although they seldom contacted each other, Skylar still insisted on taking Walter to the party. Even though the invitation explicitly stated no gifts, Skylar insisted that Walter prepare a small present. However, upon arriving at the venue, they discovered that others had brought large gifts, making Walter's palm-sized gift seem embarrassing. After meeting his old friend, they exchanged a few pleasantries. Elliot's wife was Gretchen, who had been Walter's girlfriend back in the day. It seemed there had been a love triangle, and Walter, unable to cope, chose to leave and let them be together. However, time is the best healer and Walter didn't hold a grudge, maintaining a proper relationship with them. Later, Walter visited Elliot's study, where the luxurious decor and the plethora of books filled him with envy. Looking at Elliot's honors on the wall, most of the research that made Gray Matter successful was actually Walter's. After leaving the study and seeing Skylar chatting with Elliot, Walter was about to join them but was stopped by an old classmate. The old classmate introduced Walter to his friends, saying that in college, Walter was a master of crystallography and one of the founders of Gray Matter. Walter was happy to explain the origin of the company's name. They assumed Walter was still Elliot's partner and thus must be very wealthy. However, Walter quickly explained that he preferred to focus on education. When others asked which university he was at, Walter, the high school chemistry teacher, was too embarrassed to say. But what made him even more uncomfortable was when Elliot began to open the gifts in front of everyone. Seeing that the other gifts were very expensive, Walter became anxious, fearing that Elliot would open his gift. Yet the workings of Murphy's Law were about to unfold.
Oh, this is from Walt.
Hey.
Yum good ramen. This is what Walt and I lived on for 10 months straight while we were working on our thesis. Sold them down at Ralstos in the hardware aisle, right next to the what was it?
Sterno.
The Sterno.
Yeah, 10 for $1.99.
To this day, I am convinced these noodles were responsible for our success. This was our lifeblood. Man, where'd you find these? I thought they'd been outlawed years ago. I love it. Thank you, Walt.
For the man who has everything.
Fortunately, Elliot noticed Walter's intentions, which spared the prideful Walter from embarrassment. They then reminisced about the past, and seeing how happy they both looked proved they had shared good times. Just then, Elliot proposed that Walter come back to work at Gray Matter, thinking of how he had already left Gray Matter, and due to pride, Walter politely declined Elliot's offer. But when Elliot mentioned that the company had the best medical insurance, Walter realized something was off. Could it be that Elliot knew about his lung cancer? At that moment, he noticed his wife chatting with Gretchen, occasionally glancing his way. Walter then realized the true purpose of his wife's insistence on attending the party. Angry, Walter quickly found an excuse to leave with his wife. No matter how Skylar tried to make conversation, the infuriated Walter didn't want to engage, because Walter guessed that Elliot's recruitment was his wife's idea, to get the extremely proud Walter to accept their help. They had deliberately recruited him to work at Gray Matter, but in Walter's eyes, this felt like begging for charity, something he absolutely couldn't accept. Skylar's plan thus failed. Back at home, the atmosphere became unusually quiet, with no one initiating conversation. At that moment, his son prepared to go to school. Walter, as usual, was ready to drive him, but his son said he would take the school bus. It was clear that Walter Jr. had become alienated from his father. After school, feeling gloomy, Walter Jr. decided to go buy beer with his friends to lighten the mood. However, they were all underage and buying alcohol was illegal, so they decided to have Walter Jr., who was on crutches, ask a passerby for help. Ironically, after careful observation, the person they asked turned out to be a police officer. His two friends unkindly abandoned Walter Jr. and ran away. Since it was Walter Jr.'s first offense, the officer gave him a warning and said that Walter Jr. was lucky to have such a good dad. However, the person who showed up was Hank. Hank was also worried that Walter Jr.'s actions would anger Walter. Back at home, Skylar told her son to go to his room and wait to be dealt with. Seeing that Walter was not at home, Hank asked Skylar not to tell Walter about what had just happened, saying that Walter Jr.'s actions were just part of growing up, first with controlled substances and then wanting to drink. Hearing this, Skylar looked completely baffled, and Hank turned to Marie with a similarly confused expression. Marie said to her sister, "Wasn't it you who hinted at me?" At this moment, Skylar realized what was being said. She clarified that she was referring to Walter and that it was something Walter himself had admitted. Hank finally understood why Walter Jr. had reacted the way he did when he went to the chaotic gathering place. Hank was truly embarrassed as he could never have imagined Walter getting involved in such things. Skylar mentioned that Walter had been acting unusually lately, like refusing treatment for his illness and not accepting help with medical bills. She wanted Hank and Marie to stay and help persuade Walter. Walter didn't return home until the next morning, and when he walked in, he found several people who had been waiting for a long time. Skylar was the first to take the talking pillow and began persuading Walter to accept treatment. Then the pillow was passed to Hank, who said a lot and gave various examples, but the distracted Walter didn't understand. When it was Walter Jr.'s turn to speak, he stuttered, saying Walter was like a coward because he didn't even have the courage to fight the disease. He picked up his crutches and said that he was fighting bravely against his injury and you were afraid of a little chemo treatment. His son's words brought tears to Walter's eyes. Then it was Marie's turn to speak. Clearly, she hadn't understood her sister's intentions. She expressed respect for Walter's choice. As a medical professional, she understood better than anyone the pain many patients endure during treatment, and she thought that Walter wanting to live out his last days with dignity might be his wish. Hank also agreed with Marie's perspective. This made Skylar furious and she immediately issued an eviction order to them. As the two sisters argued vehemently, the silent Walter finally exploded. He took the pillow from Marie's arms and seized this opportunity to express his own thoughts. Reflecting on his life, he realized he had hardly ever made choices for himself and now he was facing cancer, which would be his final decision. He didn't want to endure the torment of the disease in his final days. He knew the side effects of chemotherapy better than anyone, and his death would be gruesome. He didn't want to leave his family with that image. He said he chose to let nature take its course. However, when he woke up the next day and saw books on how to beat cancer on his bedside, he knew his wife's biggest fear was losing him. For his wife's sake, Walter changed his mind again. He decided not to let his wife worry anymore and accepted the hospital treatment. Then Walter drove to Jesse's house. At that moment, Gretchen called because she had heard about Walter's lung cancer. She said she and Elliot were willing to pay for Walter's treatment, but she was still refused by the prideful Walter. Walter lied about having insurance and told them not to worry. Then he went to Jesse's house. He would earn money his own way.
Yeah! Wanna cook?